feeling rooted in something and having that comfort and trust with people, I think it's a very, very strong thing, and it's the very essence of society.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something I feel like I've always felt outside of.
Yeah, well,
in
that makes two of us.
I was never in the cliques. I was always sort of. I was there. I was present. I was welcome. It's not like I was ostracized. I don't want to give this false impression of like poor little me. I was such a, but I was just always like I just always saw it as a facade, as just a charade.
Yeah.
And so I was always looking through everything, which you can't be a part of anything if you're looking through it. You just can't. You have to embrace it fully and completely. You have to believe it. You have to have it be full and substantial and real in order to really become a part of it. And because I was always sort of seeing like the veils that could be pulled aside, then it was like, how can I buy into this? And therefore I will never really be a part of it.
Yeah, well, what you're saying really, really speaks to me. And another way of kind of expressing that is, the classic Groucho Marx saying, I'd never join any club that would want to have me as a member. Yeah. And it's such a brilliant saying, because my dad's a natural joiner. He's always loved clubs and societies, whether that was sports when he was growing up, whether it's music when he couldn't play sports anymore. He played in big bands and orchestras, and he loved joining stuff. I've always hated joining stuff. I hate being in things, in clubs and societies. And if I ever stood on stage, it was as somebody who was not the chorus, but, gave an address or something like that. The idea of being in a group of people, in a team, and certainly the lot of learning that I had when I was growing up, it was very team-based. Well, you want to be part of the team so you can achieve X, Y, and Z. I remember thinking at the age of 10, I don't want to be part of a fucking team. No thanks. That's not for me. And it's that thing, if you're looking at something and analysing it all the time, you can't be in the middle of it and part of it. And you've got to make your choice, right?
Yeah, I think that's why I was inherently always a writer. Because I was always feeling like I was standing on the outside looking in. And I was always analyzing and assessing and trying to break it down, dissect, understand, get it to its most diluted pieces so that it was the most digestible in a way that was like, I will understand the core of all of this and what is really going on. And I think it's really interesting, because it actually really harkens to, like, that was, for me, like, early religion was essentially science, right?
Yeah.
Science was man trying to get to the bottom of God. Like, where is God? What is God? How do we find God between the molecules? Essentially, right? Like, that was kind of the motivation for early science. And you and I both have that stand outside the crowd and look in and observe. And it seems on the outset that we're looking for two completely different things. But I think in our book that we read this week, Conversations with God, the biggest question that kept coming up for me, and I've been dying to get on this call with you to talk to you about it, was, are we really looking for two different things, or do we just give it different names?
Yeah.
Because really, this book is like breaking down the notion of what is God. And yet it uses the very word God in the title. Like, it's not just there in the book, it's like in the title, it says God. And immediately as I was, reading it, because of course now I'm reading kind of with like, you're there with me, right?
Yeah,
it's
right
not
on.
just anymore. It's like, you're there with me. And I found myself just thinking, I wonder if Andrew, like, what his concept of God, like, what is God? Like, if that word could be defined, it's so limited, right? And yet it's so big, and it can be defined in a bajillion different ways. So I'm just diving right in.
So I'm so glad you've gone to this point, but because it really speaks to something. We're in complete harmony on this. So given the fact that we're thousands of miles away, it's so funny you've started with that, because it speaks right to the heart of something I wanted to talk about. But before I speak about that, I'll just say that this is Hard Degree, presenting Evangeline Lilly's Library of the Soul. I'm Andrew Sumner. I'm here with my mate, Evangeline Brains Lilly, all the way on the other side of the world from where I am now. And this week, we're talking about the book Conversations with God by Neale Donald Walsch. And as to your question, what is my concept of God?
Wait, before you say that, you just said brains, and it made me realize I don't.
You haven't got your specs on. Yeah, I know. I thought maybe because you're wearing that incredibly classy top, that maybe you thought maybe the brains glasses aren't working with this.
You know what? I forget to wear them all the time because it's so new to me. Yeah. And then by the end of like reading a book, I'm like, oh, why do I have a headache? And it's because I haven't been wearing them. Hang on, 2 seconds.
This is brains assembly in real time.
Yeah, exactly. Yep, they're right here. Perfect. I didn't have to go far. All right.
Yes, there we go. The full brains. In Thunderbirds, they have a catchphrase they use all the time, which is FAB. Yeah, so that was their affirmation signal because it's all about different superpowered craft. Their affirmation signal is FAB, and it's only an acronym for the 60s kaleidoscopic word fab. That was it. There's no meaning beyond that. Yeah, so fab, absolutely so fab. Fab gear, as they used to say in Liverpool. So you've really delivered it now, and it does work with the top as well. It's totally working. I feel like I'm about to say what I was about to say, but now under the death glare of the brains glasses, in front of which you can only speak the truth.
Yes, whatever you say, it better be inspired.
It better be good. Better be good. The thing for me, my conception of God is I've always looked at God as a kind of a man-made, a human-made construct. Yeah, in terms of how God is kind of explained to people and has been explained to human society, and I think the concept of God for me is that I don't look in terms of God in terms of God is something that can be any way individualized. So the classic what am I looking for? Cliche is the guy in the robe with the long white beard and the long white hair and all that kind of stuff. But that's only one facet of what God is to people. I think if I'm not even sure if I would look at things in terms of there is God a figure or a central source of the grand design. My personal view is that the universe is far more complex than that, and it is complex to the point where it's completely beyond the ability of human beings to actually see what that grand design is, and we're never going to find an answer, no matter how many, and no matter that we may all in our own ways dedicate our lives to searching. The reason why it always rings true to me that it's actually the journey that's important. Is the journey is all you're going to get. Because I just don't think that you're going to open the door in the movie palace at the end and suddenly think, man, that was it. Or, as you go towards the light, suddenly all of life's mysteries are revealed to you. I think it's such a complex and multi-leveled and four-dimensional mystery that I just don't think we are capable of seeing it. So therefore, what sits at the heart of that is absolutely fascinating, but I do not think it's any kind of directive being or presence. I just don't think that's what it is. And I'm much more interested in a kind of, I never use the term God. If anything, if I ever say, well, if something happens to a friend of mine or an acquaintance of mine, in a place where you might go, well, that's God's design for you. I would never think of saying that in a million years. I might go, the universe has conspired for these events to take place with you, right? And that is definitely the way I look at it. And that's what speaks to me about, say, a religion like Shinto, which doesn't really, have, kind of a humanized figures in terms of those who are worshipped. And I can absolutely see why there are human deities or deities with elements of human physiognomy in them, of course, because that's about projection, right? But for me, I think the whole game is about the universe.
Well, I think it's about projection, and then I also think it's about giving us something we can wrap our head around.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Like you said, what's the truth is something that we maybe cannot wrap our head around.
100%.
Do you remember in the 90s, there were those auto stereogram images that were like all rage, and they were just a kaleidoscope of a million tiny little pictures, and when put together and seen through a kind of blurred eye, like if you did something really to your eye and the way you looked at the picture, suddenly you saw a greater picture.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you remember those?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
I feel like that's a great metaphor for God.
Yeah.
Like that all the goings on of the world, from the microscopic organisms to the ants to the larger great geopolitical things going on with human beings to like the global things that go on with the weather. If you took all the pictures, all the snapshots, and you put them all together as a tapestry, right, there is God. Yeah.
Yeah.
That kind of what you.
Yeah. That's kind of it. And also, I think the ever presence of that, of what you just said. I think I'm about to come up with what might be the most obscure and nonsensical God analogy I've ever heard anybody say. Maybe I'm wrong, but I tell you what it's like. It's like the presence of a greater design, shall we say, which is how I'm much more comfortable about talking about God. Not that I've got a problem saying God, but to me, God is kind of a narrative construct. So whenever I talk about God, I'm immediately thinking about all the different ways I've seen God portrayed in books and movies, many of which I love. And when I was talking about the Little World of Don Camillo stories, right, one of the things about God in those books is absolutely humanized, as a person with a voice, which is very relevant for the book we're going to talk about, by the way, and I want to get into that in a second. But one of the ways I look at that universal design is that hints of it, a presence of it, are always there in any image or landscape or soundscape that you look at or listen to, but not there overtly in the center of the image, just there on the corner of the screen. And it's like that scene in Rambo, where the soldiers, the National Guardsmen, are looking for Rambo in the forest, and he's picked them off one by one. There's only a hardcore of them left, but they all want to kill him at this point. And they're using thermal imaging detectors to try and find him, but they can't. And that's because he's basically stripped himself down and jumped into this freezing cold mud to lower his body temperature. And they're all jumping over a rise in the mud. And he suddenly, at one point in the corner of the screen, opens his eyes. And his eyes are lit in a way that you instantly see him, but he's been there the whole time in the corner of the screen watching these National Guardsmen. You realize, oh man, this guy, he's completely such a high-level special forces guys. These guys don't stand a chance, right? But it's that whole thing of, you look back on the image 5 decades later and you notice something in the corner of it that you can't quite understand why it's there or what it is, but you perceive it in a different way. And it's like when people used to see, now and again, when you see supernatural images, we go, but where are these extra feet from in this image? You know what I mean? Or somebody's hiding under the bed and you look at the picture and in the corner you can see a pair of eyes under the slats of the bed. It's that kind of thing, if that's making any sense.
It absolutely is. It actually really speaks to exactly where I was at in my life when I first read these books, which was, now it would have been just a little over about 15 years ago-ish. And I was the last book we talked about, I was, I was in this sort of lost space between high school and the rest of my life, right? What was going to happen. And at this point in my life, I have actually been cast on the show Lost. I've been working on the show for less than a year. And I have I'm in the midst of because I'm going through a divorce. Yeah. And the divorce is like, as anyone knows who's gone through a divorce, you can't say, I just got divorced. Because there's no such thing as a sort of point in time where it feels like, now I'm divorced. It's just this very sticky process that carries on and carries on and carries on. And you just keep sloughing it away. It doesn't just go away the minute you sign papers or, do what you're supposed to do legally. So I was in the midst of a divorce. And for me, divorce became a massive existential crisis. Because up to that point in my life, I had been very devoutly Christian. And when I sinned, it was always like, oops, my humanity got in the way and I did something wrong. Or it was like, you know, I swore like a sailor even back then, but I was just like, God doesn't give a shit about the words I use. Like, he just doesn't care. Like, I had a different sort of morality surrounding it than what I was taught at church. But this was the first time that I knew in my heart that there was a law, a divine law about this. And I premeditated to break that law. And I knew I was going against God's word, and I did it anyway. And I couldn't make sense of that within myself. And I every single time I prayed about it. And as I mentioned last time, you know, I've always, as far back as I can remember, I've had a two-way communication with something else that is not me. Yeah. And I've always called it God. And whenever I would pray, the answer that came back was always just as clear as it had always been. That communication was clear, and it was always the same, which is essentially, I'm not invested either way. Like, you're not going to offend me or hurt me with this choice. It doesn't affect me, and it doesn't affect this at all. And I was like, okay, but that's not what it says in this book.
Yeah,
that's
right on.
Yes, in this book, and that's your official word. And I've been believing that very strongly for a long time. So if you're telling me that this is not the final word, if this is not right in this particular situation right now, my entire faith is crumbling. My entire world is crumbling, because I can't justify then that this is the holy and infallible word of God. And if it's not, then where does that leave me spiritually? Where does that leave me in my faith? So I was in a massive existential crisis that for me was very, very painful, because I was so passionately devout, and my relationship with God was the core and center of who I am and who I was. And so I was in a really, between the divorce, the existential crisis, and then also being launched into international fame overnight, coming from like Hodunk, Canada, and like nothing, no experience with anything like this before. And knowing before I started, I would hate fame, and having that confirmed very, very, very strongly, very immediately, that was not a fun game for me. I was in a mess. I was drinking a bottle of wine every night just to get to sleep. I was having moments that felt like I belong in an asylum. I was mentally feeling very unhinged. And I was in another sort of dark night of the soul. I was really in a bad place. I wanted to quit the job. I wanted to walk away from acting and never turn back. I had all of these, physical things going on. Of course, whenever anything is amiss inside, I find it manifests physically in my physical body.
Yeah.
And I had a girlfriend who had gone to Rwanda to do short-term missions and had fallen in love with a Rwandese man and had wanted to get married to him. And she couldn't, because they couldn't afford to make it work with visas and everything that had to happen with the cross-country thing, because they both were poor missionaries. And I remember vowing before I got the job on Lost that if I ever came into money somehow, that I would make this marriage happen, because I thought it was so wrong and so horrible that two people who were in love couldn't be together because of money. I just thought that was disgusting. And so I had agreed to financially support their marriage, and they were going to get married in South Africa. And they said, wow, will you please be in the wedding? And I don't know if you remember last time we spoke, my dream had been to be a missionary in Africa.
Right. Oh,
I'd never been to Africa before. And I was like, yes, I will come. I will be there. And it was a dream come true for me to go to Africa. But I said, the deal is I will come and be in your wedding, even though like we weren't close friends. We barely knew each other. But I was like, I'll come and be in your wedding if you'll take me and show me your work in Rwanda after the wedding. Yeah. So I went to South Africa, and then I went to Rwanda. And while I was in Rwanda, recentering, getting away from the crazy that my life had been for that year, this book had somehow come to me, and I cracked it open and I started reading. I will never forget where I was. I will never forget the first time I read the words that hell is just a human creation, that the devil is just mythology, like all these notions that what you just said about, in hindsight, you look back and it's like that thing that was in the corner of the picture that was always there. You always knew it, but you just weren't looking at it, or you just weren't recognizing what it really was. And it felt like every word in this book for me at that time in my life was exactly that. It was like the, auto stereogram where suddenly I figured out how to focus my eyes in the right way.
Yes.
And it was like things that I have always known, that were always there, just became crystallized, and somebody put words to them and validated that they could be true, they could be real, and that could be okay. And that became the beginning of rebuilding what was my sense of being able to have a faith. It's like, I don't have to just be faithless, because now I no longer think that the Bible is like, it's something you can't touch, but it's like, no, I could carry on having this beautiful relationship I had nurtured, and it was just going to look real different than it had ever looked before.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Where were you exactly when you read the book for the first time?
I was in this girlfriend. She had just gotten married. I only gave them 2 weeks alone for their little honeymoon around the Cape area of South Africa. And then we went to their home, and I was this is their first time living in their new home in Rwanda together. And there I am, a house guest in their first 2 weeks or 3 weeks there. And I was in my bedroom in that house, their guest room. And I was laying belly down on the bed. And the sounds are different, were different in Rwanda than where I've been living. The feeling of the air was different. The whole atmosphere was completely different. And for me was utterly enchanting. I had fallen deeply in love with Rwanda the moment I got off the plane, and also was able to recenter and find myself to be able to go back and do season 2 of Lost without losing my mind. But I was on that bed, I was belly down. And I think that Mona might have been pittering around the house. And I remember feeling like a touch guilty, because she was a missionary. She was very Christian. And here I was reading this book that at the time I didn't know this, but my sister told me later on, preachers across America, across the world, had been preaching from the pulpit that this was like the work of the devil, that this book was evil, that you should protect your children from it, that it will, ruin your faith, and that it was a dangerous, evil book. And I didn't know that was happening, but I did know that she wouldn't agree with what I was reading in that book, and feeling a sort of inner amen to, that she would be horrified to know that this is where my heart was moving.
Now that's very interesting, because what you mentioned there, do you remember last week when we were talking about the whole concept of the Bible having been treated for hundreds of years as an immortal document, right? That consistently throughout, and I hadn't realized quite in the moment that what a preview of this conversation that would be. But of course, I look at this stuff and I read it as somebody, who wouldn't, wouldn't describe themselves, wouldn't identify as a Christian. But this take on what Christianity is much more powerful to me than that, that unyielding immortal document around which there's a whole bunch of organization and bureaucracy that has developed. The fact that essentially the message that I took from this book is that, your relationship with God is a personal one. And actually, however it is administered, if it's working for you, that is the key. Rather than you have to listen to the way that you're told to do it. It's the way that speaks to you personally that is the key. And I've always felt instinctively, whatever your faith, whatever your belief is, that's absolutely
right,
an approach that is completely valid. So do you know what I really loved? It's the whole concept of, and it's expressed very early on in book 1, that the most common form of communication is through feeling, and feeling is the language of the soul. Now that feels exactly right to me.
Yeah. And that the word is the lesser purveyor of truth. I liked that expression, right? Yeah. Words.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's why I found it really interesting that the word choice in the title is God. Because throughout the book, it talks about the I am. And I feel like we both would probably agree that's a great, accurate expression of God, right? It's just what is. Like, it is the I am. And yet on the cover, they decided to use the word God, which I think is actually quite brilliant because it would probably be more accessible to more people, because I think the majority of the population of the world believes in God. But I love that it says that words are the lesser purveyor of truth, because as my journey went on, one of the things I started to realize when I started to examine other faiths and other versions of spirituality and other versions of, connection to this greater force or greater power or communal energy, was that, we have such limitation to express these things with language. And we have many, many languages in the world. So where two people might fight because one person says Allah and one person says God, and then you break it down and realize, but Allah is the Arabic word for God. Yeah. It's like, it's the same thing.
It's the same fucking thing. Yeah, absolutely.
And what you said about this book being that continuation. So I gotta put brains on now. Yeah. I thought it was amazing. I did a little bit of digging around in Acts, because Acts is the book of the Bible. I used to be like a super Bible nerd. Yeah. So I did a bit of digging around in Acts, which is when the church started to be moved by the Holy Spirit, which is feeling, right? It was like Jesus had died and gone and left behind the Holy Spirit to guide and to be the thing that actually like moved the church forward. And the Pharisees, of course, the men who were in charge of the church and in charge of faith back then, were trying to persecute and kill and eliminate these new Christians, because what they were saying was heresy, right? It was all very evil and wrong. And it was it Paul? Who was it? I'd have to, hang on, let me look. You can, I think it was Stephen. Yeah, it was Stephen. Stephen ends up being trapped by the Pharisees and questioned. And he just absolutely gives them hell. And he says, "For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs Moses handed down." This is from the Old Testament in the Bible. He's quoting the Old Testament. "However, the Most High does not live in houses made by men. As the prophet says, 'Heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me? Or where will my resting place be?'" In other words, how can you limit God to one doctrine, one faith, one idea? The Holy Spirit moves. And then he says, "You stiff-necked people with uncircumcised hearts and ears, you are just like your fathers. You always resist the Holy Spirit. Was there ever a prophet your fathers did not persecute?" And meanwhile, 2,000 years later, another person comes along and says, "Hey, I've also heard from God. Here's the new word from God." And once again, you stiff-necked people, it's like they get so stuck. There's such a stiffness. There's such a stuck. And yet it's right there in the Bible. It says, don't get stuck. Don't stay in one idea or in one place, but like allow your feelings to guide you. Allow the Holy Spirit to move. Yeah, and I thought that was important.
But human beings have a deep-seated attachment in all cultures to bureaucracy, and the problem, and because people are so comfortable getting into patterns of behaviour give forth to bureaucracy, and bureaucracy lives on, beyond generations, whether that's in the workplace, whether it's in society, whatever. On the minute you start organising shit, the problem with it is that very human need and attraction towards bureaucracy just means that you get codification, and you get suddenly you get all these brittle lines around you about what you can and can't do. And as we've talked about before, one of the issues with formal Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism, whatever it is essentially you're talking about a bunch of bureaucratic constructs that a bunch of dudes 1,000 years ago in a very different society came up with, you know, and actually, surely the interesting thing about faith and belief is, you know, it has to be malleable and has to be fluid, and it can't be just contained by somebody's rules. That doesn't work. I actually think what Neale Donald Walsch did with either him or his editors, but including God in the cover on the title, that's the kind of stealth bomb of, you go and buy it because you're devout, and you open up and it's like, holy fuck, this guy's telling me that I shouldn't be listening to holy people, I shouldn't be listening to rabbis, I shouldn't be listening to priests, I shouldn't be listening to vicars. It's about my personally.
Or I should, if it aligns with my truth.
If I want to. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If I feel it and it's meaningful to me.
Yes. And if it's not, okay. Now take a closer look at that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
So when you got back, I guess you were going back to Hawaii to shoot season 2 of Lost, right?
Yeah.
After you'd had that experience. How did it then play out for you, you know, over that next phase of your life?
Well, so this book, as you may have recognized, is 3 books. So similar to the Final Quest, it's 2 books. And this one is 3 books, and they're enormous. So I have, this is my version of the collection, and it's behemoth, you know, it's enormous. And so I actually read the 3 books over the course of the next 3 seasons of Lost. So I think I finished the final book. Again, I remember where I was, what I was doing. I was on a road trip between Vancouver and Los Angeles, and I'd gone up to that Glacier Lake in Washington. I can't remember the name of it now, but it's absolutely incredible, aqua green, blue, like milky water up in the mountains. And I was sitting up beside that lake when I finished the 3rd book. And it was a slog. It was a lot to get through. And I read it over those years. And the whole time there was this bell ringing inside saying, yes, this is truth. I am reading truth. And then there was this wrestling with, how do I turn that belief up here in my head into the kind of cellular belief that I have had about Christianity for 28 years? Like, how do I make that a part of me now? Because even though I go, yes, I hear that, that's true. Everything about how I've organized my life, everything about how I see the world, everything about who I am is rooted in a different belief. And so changing like that becomes a great challenge. And I think, you know, when I read it this time, so I read it, I'm reading it again. I haven't read all 3, obviously, but the thing that I ended up coming up against that really rubbed me this time, that was difficult, whereas the first time, I think it was exactly what I needed at that moment, was how incredibly cerebral it is. It's just this logical slog. I mean, the polar opposite of the Vision, right? Talk about that.
The polar opposite of the Emily Bronte Wuthering Heights emotional extremity of the Vision, and this is I found it. I think my issue with it is, on the one hand, it felt far more authentic than the Vision did. I love the bombast of the Vision, but it feels like going and watching the 1812 overture or something, right? Whereas this, I felt an emotional reality to it, but it's as if the world's most spiritually attuned and yet dullest librarian was telling me a very, very, very long story. And you're like, okay, mate, I get it. Personal topics, global topics, universal truths. I'm all over that. Give me 50 pages on each of those, and that's what you need. I'm certain this book doesn't need to be thousands of pages long, right? Like the telephone directory.
Yeah, that's exactly. But I again saw the exact same weakness that you're going to get in every single book of truth or otherwise, truth or lies, you know, both can be learned from anyway, which is that you cannot get yourself out of the way when channeling anything from outside of you. You can't. So what I saw was a man who was extremely yang, extremely logical, extremely stuck in his brain, who what he needed in that moment was for God to break down his mental ideas of God. And he was going to take some real, like, hitting him over the head over and over and over for him to get it. And so that's what this turned into. And I think that's what I needed in the moment that I read it. I was extremely cerebral. If you had tried to have a debate with me about God when I was an evangelical Christian, I would not have gone into an emotional place nor an irrational place. I love doing it from a very logical place. Like, I would like to go head to head with people on a cerebral level of like, I can make sense of this for you. And so I was still in that space. I have since moved into a more feeling place, into a place of being much more connected to my emotions, which were things that up to then I was quite afraid of. And so rereading it now, I had that experience you had of like, okay, I'm actually resistant to this because what it's asking me to do is to get in my head about God and understand him on a logical level, or her, or them, or us, or it, which is, I agree with you, not possible. And not the point. Like, we don't need to explain God. We need to experience God. Yeah. Right. And so for me, that was a struggle again. And it made me again think of you, because I thought, well, I know Andrew likes logic, and I know he likes science. And I know that he doesn't like all the touchy-feely stuff of like the Emily and like the vision and all that. Whereas I'm much more in that space. I love to feel. I love to move out of feeling. And I thought, I wonder if he'll love this, or if he'll struggle the way I'm struggling with like it being extremely cerebral.
Yeah. And the reality is that I found the message very, very interesting. And again, and it's nearly always my issue with faith-based literature, particularly faith-based literature that is designed to, upend a belief system that's in place, or to look at something from a different angle. And my issue often is that while these books have a genuine power to them, and the writer is genuinely trying to achieve something, and it's pouring out of them, you can see it pouring out of them. Yeah. What very few of them can do is write really well, and that gets in the way for me. It's the fact that there's no real art to what they're doing. The art of the assembly isn't good enough. And when you, as I know you do, when you really enjoy words and how they're put together, to see them put together monotonously in these very boring, word sequences that kind of echo, at the point where you're like, okay, I get the power of the message, and it is quite powerful actually, and it does really speak to me because it's much more in line with what I think than say what we were reading last week. But because the delivery is so kind of turgid and there's no real art to the delivery, that's where I struggle.
Now, do you think that? Let me rephrase that. I think that there is a time and a place and a space for messages and truth to be delivered through art, and then there is also a need for them just to be directly spoken. Yeah. And for me, I want both in my life. So I turn to fiction when I want good writing. And I turn to these types of books, more instructional books, when I want to be like struck with a wrought iron. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean.
Yeah. That's the truth. Right. I remember, and get about my business again and go back to, falling in love with fantasy. For me, these types of books are anchors. And I actually find myself always, by some grace of my nature and just how I was born, I have this ability to see through and not mind the flaws in the writer. And it was funny, last week you mentioned about Rick Joyner and the research you'd done on him and what you'd learned about his personal life. And I sat there listening to you thinking, wow, I have read multiple books by Rick Joyner and I had no idea who he was. I never cared. I was never interested because for me, that wasn't significant. That wasn't relevant. The messages I received from whatever message he felt he received was what was relevant to me. And yet for you as a journalist, that's like an enormous part of your understanding of something, right? Is the vessel with which it comes through, right?
Absolutely right. Although it's very interesting that you say that, because without us having had this specific conversation last week, this week what I thought I would do is so I read A Conversation with God without actually looking up Neale Donald Walsch. I thought I need to just come to this cold and see how it feels. Yeah. So I did that very deliberately. Funnily enough, after we got into that conversation, not funnily enough at all, it makes complete sense. After we talked about last week, I'm like, I've really got to just come to the words and see what it's like. And actually, what I found is I don't disagree with your point. I think you're making an extremely valid point. I think for me, the lack of artifice and the lack of technique is actually a very good thing when you're imparting a real message. Yeah. If anything, I would say that where he has been poorly served, either by his fervor to deliver the message and get everything down on the page, or by the cooperation of those around him who form that stuff onto the pages, I just think it's wildly overwritten. It's too long. Yeah. So I think I'm certain and I've only read the first book, but I'm certain every salient point from the first book can be made in a third to half of the space that he took.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because rereading it, when I read the introduction, I felt like done.
Yeah, exactly. But he does. Before he even starts the book.
Beautiful piece. Yeah. That is like, that's it. That's the whole message of the book. And yet, if you see, you are not reading it from a place of being entrenched in the belief that he is breaking down. And
that's a good point. That's a good point.
Then repetition becomes absolutely paramount to shifting worldview, right? Because worldview is so heavy. And, you can try and lift it up and throw it away in one foul swoop. It will not happen. Trust me, because you asked about the years following this book. I read this book probably about 15 years ago, and I am I feel like I'm just in the last year starting to finally get an answer to my prayer, which was, can you please help me make this like my belief in here, not just up here?
Yeah.
Because it's so hard once you've been put into, because of course in the church there is loads of repetition, and the repetition has a function, right? We all know that repetition, there's a reason we go to school, and that we learn the same shit every year in elementary school. I'm now homeschooling my kids, and I'm like, wait a minute, we taught you all of this last year. Why is it in the curriculum again this year? And it's like, well, if you don't repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, it doesn't become second nature. And I think that is probably the function in this. But I also think, again, like it really just harkens to the vessel, like who is doing the writing and what does he need in that moment, much more than what do you need in this moment. Like if you needed this book, I believe it will just come to you. Like that's sort of my belief in the beautiful perfection of the way this mystery works, right? And it came to me, and it was exactly what I needed. Now I sort of forced the issue and like went back to reread it, and I found myself doing that kind of like, whoa, like I almost was like a little bit nervous, because I felt like I don't want to get back in my head. I just got out of it. And I don't want to get back in my head about trying to justify or be logical about God. Like that's not where I want to be right now. So I actually I stopped reading after a while. After a while, I just thought, this is no longer serving me. I've gotten out of it what I wanted, which was to sort of remember, and that's enough. But I'm sure you probably read, what is it called? I don't know if it's the intro or the acknowledgements at the very, very beginning.
I did. Yeah, I remember those very clearly, actually.
Yeah. And he says in it, he talks at the end about, I need now to say that I am, having read and reread the wisdom contained here, deeply embarrassed by my own life. And he goes on to say, I apologize to everybody for the slowness of my learning. Yet I am encouraged by God to grant myself forgiveness for my failings and not live in fear and guilt, but to always keep trying. And I feel like that's what this book is like. It's like a manifestation of that, right? Like he's slow to learn. He's got his own shit he's working through. Sorry, here I am doing it publicly. And I hope you can all forgive me for that. But this is, I'm a human being, right?
This, by the way, touches upon one of the main sort of precepts of religion, which I really struggle with. So this very intelligent man who's very much connected with himself, and has had almost like an epiphany of like, I've got to get all this down. This is the way my relationship with a higher power, whatever it may be, is working. The fact that he feels it's incumbent upon himself to sort of ghostly apologize for his own life, I'm not down with that at all. I just cannot feel that, because my personal belief is that in whatever form God, a higher power, the universe exists, the need to kind of like debase ourselves in front of our faith and apologize and go, I'm terribly sorry for being human, that feels completely like a human construct to me, not a divine construct. And the truth is that whatever God, the higher power is, the thing that's created us, if it's created us, it's created us the way we are, warts and all, embarrassment, stupidity, profanity, all as part of that glorious mix. So we don't have to fucking apologize for it to anybody, is my view. Yeah. And if that makes sense.
No, it makes complete sense. I love that you brought this up because it's so rife for discussion right now.
Yes.
Particularly in the environment we currently live in.
Right.
I mean, Me Too, Time's Up environment where your past failings or your past mistakes or your past transgressions can absolutely dethrone, dehumanize, and destroy your life at this point in our kind of collective cultural history in the West.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, what do you think about that in this environment? Like, does a guy like him have to put that in his book, because otherwise that book will be discontinued? I mean, Zeus's books have been discontinued right now. There are Dr. Zeus books that have been, they've stopped printing them because he made,
he used some of the idioms of the time. Yeah.
Of the time, exactly.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of contextualization when it comes to things like that. So one of the things that I thought worked really, really well is some time ago when Warner Brothers collected a lot of the wartime Warner Brothers cartoons, like with Bugs Bunny and with Daffy Duck, but when they're fighting the Nazis and stuff like that, there's a whole bunch of stereotypes that come up in those things and in Tom and Jerry. So they had people with a contemporary voice, whether that be Whoopi Goldberg or somebody else, going, look, this is what happens in these cartoons, by the by. It doesn't invalidate them. It just means that, of course, you wouldn't do it now, but you've got to look at it through a prism of the contemporary modern day. So I think that's one thing. And I think the other thing is that the problem with documentation of everything, and we live in a world where everything is documented in real time. I don't think these are the only issues. The other big issues you've got is like societal shaming of young people among each other. So footage from one young person to another, irrespective of gender, race, religion, creed, whatever, is you see something you don't like and you take that footage and you use it to make yourself feel good and to torture them and make them feel bad. And that is tremendously unhealthy. And I think the entire instinct is completely off, however it's deployed and however you slice it. And I think people have always been struggling against that. And unfortunately, the tools that we have in contemporary society allow you to douse that in lighter fuel and set it on fire and accelerate it at a rate that we've never seen or experienced before.
And make it global.
Yeah, and make it global in seconds. Yeah.
In seconds.
And people are so quick to judge, because judgmentality is such a whole topic I'd love to get into with you, because again, that's founded on a precept of somehow my view is better than yours. Now, some things are kind of immortally and demonstrably true, right? Nazism is a terrible thing, right? And there are a bunch of it. There are so many extremes of human behavior. You can go, that is absolutely on any level wrong, but judging other people for being worse for you on whatever scale you want to do in the moment, that is generally an instinct to be avoided, I think. And that's very simplistic, but it's absolutely true.
Well, it's probably the main reason why I would still, if somebody said to me today, would you still call yourself a Christian? I would say, yeah, of course I would, because a Christian is directly translated as a Christ follower. And he was a badass rebel saying, stop judging each other. That is not the purpose. That is not divine. That is not the good stuff. The good stuff is in, love and acceptance and, being groovy. Like I always think of like Jesus was like a groovy dude. He was just like, hey, let's all get along, right? Like, and I think
he even looked like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo.
Exactly. And I think that all boils back down to the point that you started with, which is this notion of, is there such a thing as right and wrong? And if there is, how do we navigate that where we don't just live in a world of judgment? And it really dials into probably the one fundamental doctrinal issue that I had with conversations with God, which was that I noticed Neale was constantly trying to explain or make excuses for why there is evil in the world in a way that would sort of leave God blameless.
Yeah.
And I found myself questioning it, because I felt like you've established so clearly that God is the I am, that God is everything, that God is you, me, the ant, the clouds, the universe, the everything. And if that is what God is, then that means that God is all those things that we hate. And that is part of it, that it is not outside of God, because if God is everything, nothing is outside of God. If God is the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, death and life, right? Then we have a very limited idea of God if God can only be the things that we deem good, that make us feel good, that make us feel happy, that make us feel joy, that all the things that make us feel pain and suffering, well, that's not God. That's a very small idea, right? That's a very tiny little idea, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Well said about that. I think ultimately, the thing that Neale Donald Walsch can't do, and I think you said this very clearly before, he's got this stuff pouring out of him, but he can't divorce himself from who he actually is at the same time, which is what's happened with both of the authors we've discussed thus far.
And I think that happens with all of us. And I think that's what happens when we have these very, very, righteous attitudes right now in culture that are so powerfully judgmental, is that they have these ideas, people have ideas of right and wrong, and they can't divorce themselves from them. I am guilty of the same thing. I mean, one of the things that I have done over the last year for the first time in my life is really sat down with my fear. When I was young, I had this attitude about fear, which was beautiful for the time, which was, fear is a construct. Fear is a delusion. And so I can eradicate fear from my life, and I will. So anything I was afraid of, I would just face it. Like if I was afraid of the water. So I learned to surf, I learned to dive, I learned to scuba dive. Like I did all this stuff because I was like, fuck that shit. I'm not going to be afraid of anything. I'm never going to be afraid. I was afraid of, I'm trying to think of I just know I spent time intentionally overcoming fear. But what I have since learned is that overcoming fear is different than actually facing your fear and making room for fear and being with fear. And as a mother and as a grown woman in this particular time and era right now, I have incredible fear surrounding control and fascism. Yeah. I feel like all of the constructs are being laid in place, that with the amount of technology and ability to survey and ability to control, that we are in so much trouble. All it takes is one bad egg to get into power, which we have a lot of them already, and we could be in a kind of hell we could never have imagined back when Hitler was on Earth, because he didn't have access to these kinds of mechanisms for control. And so I have this stewing terror of this. It keeps me up at night. I worry about this. And most of my social activism is stuff that surrounds, fixing those issues of surveillance and giving too much power to technology and to corporations and governments. But sitting with that fear, it rubs up against everything I believe, which is that ultimately everything is as it should be. and that this is perfect, because I have my inherent judgments of like, I want to be free. I don't want to be controlled. And that makes me uncomfortable. And that would just make me want to die. Like I would rather die than not be free. And so those judgments get into the place where I can really, really believe that if you don't understand how dangerous control can be, there's something wrong with you. You know?
Yeah, right.
You know?
Yeah.
And I see it in myself. Like we all have that. And where the work comes in is recognizing it in myself, you know, recognizing like, where are my fears? And I think that was really unconsciously what motivated me years ago to start writing the Squickerwonkers.
Yes.
That was how we first met, was talking about my children's storybook, the Squickerwonkers.
Yeah, of course.
And it was an exploration of the shadow side, a side that I'd always been told was evil and I should stay away from it and I should be above it and I should, you know, not grapple with the devil. And it was like, I think through this sort of reshaping of theology that I was able to finally say, I'm going to like look, but I'm going to look through characters because it's way too scary just to like look at myself directly. Yeah. And I think that's what a lot of writers do, right? Is you create characters so that you can look at yourself through them.
Absolutely. They're an objective lens through which you can reflect yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And then people, when they came out, were asking, which Squickerwonker are you? Which Squickerwonker are you? And I kept saying, well, I'm not really, I didn't write any of them to be me. Like none of them are me. And I would try to come up with a cute little word, like, oh, maybe I'm like Carrie the controlling, like, you know, whatever. But through finally having the courage to really look my own fears in the eye, I realized, oh, of course, I should have known already. I'm the central character. I'm Papa the Proud. I am pulling the strings. I'm the puppet master. And the reason I'm Carrie the Controlling or Papa the Proud is because I'm so terrified of being controlled that I want to control everything else around me to make sure I'm never controlled. And it was like, oh my God, like what? But really, I think it starts, all of this judgment culture starts when we judge ourselves. And that, you know, brings us full circle to your gripe with him, you know, verbally chastising himself in front of the world, saying, I'm so sorry, I'm so terrible, which I understand why he would have the impulse to do. As somebody in the public eye, gosh, like I am so terrified of sounding in any way comfortable with myself because I feel like everyone will just want to tear you down if you are. But it really is, it starts there with like self-chastisation, self-judgment that we are taught from such a young age, especially in the, you know, in religious cultures. And then you project that out into the world. Of course you will.
Of course. I mean, that there is a very tricky middle ground between being a crazy, self-believing braggart and being a self-chastiser, you know, self-chastising, self-flagellating, self-hater, you know, and you know, those are the two polar opposites, right? But you have to exist in the middle of that. You know, you've got to have a degree of self-confidence matched to the degree of self-knowing humility. And, you know, you shouldn't be the first in the room to beat yourself up. There were so many things that you touched upon there, but I would say that in the conversation, in the commentary that you just made, I think the two things that really spoke to me, which we should examine further in future editions, are absolutely the concept of control versus what is actually happening in society. I think hitting upon the kind of these crazy out of control technological developments which are directly affecting our lives is fascinating, because while often people talk in terms of the conspiracy of it and the government of it and the corporate evil of it, all of which is true to varying degrees, I would say the real problem that we have here is a bunch of unregulated individuals who have ushered in tremendous technological change over a very short space of time versus the rest of human history. And actually, all of our constructs of government haven't caught up with that. So you get these supremely powerful individuals who are controlling the message. And that's a very unusual space. It's not somebody being elected or finagling their way to power and sitting on top of a national machine. And it's not a question of there's a big conspiracy out there, because in reality, when you analyze any kind of decision, you just realize how foolish and weak and idiotic human beings can actually be. You know, when you're in a corruptive environment, you know, when you've suddenly got all this power, generally what generally plots events are just the stupid mistakes people make or the oversights they make. It's not that they're sitting there like a Marvel villain behind a long desk, tenting their hands together like Blofeld from James Bond going, right, and now we do this. That's not what Mark Zuckerberg is like. That's not what Gates is like. That's not what these guys are like. You know, they went in trying to do one thing and they almost accidentally built this entire world machine around them. And now they're sat there going, holy fuck, you know, that we're controlling the whole world at this point. And I think that's a very, very interesting thing to examine. And I think your whole relationship with fear to me is fascinating, because I think that's absolutely true, that fear isn't to be rejected, it's to be understood and embraced. And once you actually understand and embrace what it is that scares you, that allows you to navigate around it. And that's clearly what you're doing now, you know. And but it's very easy to go, I'm just going to reject this and overcome it, because at the end of the day, combat don't actually work. That they don't build lasting solutions. Actually, what builds lasting solutions is cooperation and understanding, right? With oneself as well as with society at large.
And like you said, you know, the impulse for me is, as somebody, you know, going back to where we began, as somebody who has always tended to exist just slightly outside of the circle, is to retreat. You know, when I see something that scares the living shit out of me, I go, I'm out. You guys have your own problems. I'm going to have like a yurt, and I'll be off grid, and I'll be over here living my little Garden of Eden while you guys just all, you know, deal with whatever mess you're making. My first impulse was to be like, see, this is why I hate social media. This is why I hate technology. This is why I hate being a part of the group, right? Like being in the colony. It's just gross. I don't want to be in it. I want to be on the outside. And then right away, because of 6 years of the current practice I have, I heard myself say that. And I was like, well, why don't we sit down with that? And let's examine that reaction. What does that mean? Why? Why do you want out? And I was able to see so clearly, if I can't win, I don't want to play.
Right. Okay.
People aren't going to like me. They're not going to think I'm great. And I don't even want to play in your circle. I just want to be outside of it. And it was so elementary, and it was so juvenile, and it was so pedantic. And yet, if I hadn't just taken a moment to really look at what was going on, why I had this impulse to retreat, I wouldn't have realized that really all it's about is sort of pride and fear and, you know, wanting to be loved, as opposed to like, I don't care if y'all love me or not, you know, that bullshit. Like, we do, we're humans, we're human creatures. And we all want to be, whether we admit it or not, on some level in the hive. And we don't want to be left outside of the hive. We die. Yeah, you know,
it's so true. And that's what everybody wants to carry around, is that truth and that sense of self. And I think that universal need to feel love and acceptance, and the way it colors everything we do in our lives and every reaction we have, and being truthful with ourselves when we find ourselves being like steered into areas where actually our brain is almost playing that emotional trick where you could have ended up feeling it, but you took the time to understand it. I think recognizing our relationship with our own emotions and our own need for acceptance is a brilliant place to park this episode, where we've been talking about Conversations with God by Neale Donald Walsch. Well, that's what we started talking about, but we've really been talking about so much more than just that. And again, it's about, as we were talking earlier in our conversation, to bring this full circle, it's about the journey, and the journey of the conversation is what fascinates me.
Yeah.
And on our next
I'm biting my tongue right now, because I'm like, as with last time I'm telling the listeners, I emailed Andrew afterwards, and I was like, oh my God, I have so many more things I want to talk about now that came up in our conversation.
Me too.
And so at the end, I always, when I can feel you closing, I'm like, okay, don't say that other thing. Right now, you just let it go and just like end this.
But what's heartening about that is actually a lot of the things that we almost got into talking about last week, we got into talking about this week organically without forcing it. And I think, if you talk to the point, and I say this as a big talker, you talk to the point that your powder's completely dry. It's not interesting in it within any conversation to just grind to a halt where you eventually fall asleep on each other, right? Not that I feel that there's any chance of that happening with you and I, but there might be a chance of happening if somebody's sitting at home listening to this podcast and it goes into hour 3. Yeah. So next week we're going to be talking about the subversively feministic, the red tent.
Yes, so, by Anita Damon. And I'm very excited for this one. It really marks a kind of very obvious shift in the material that we're reading right now, which clearly indicates a major shift that was happening within me.
Yeah. I can't wait to get into it. So if anybody wants to check that out in the upcoming week, it's The Red Tent. And who's the author again, Brains?
Anita Damon.
Anita Damon, yeah. And I'm Andrew Sumner. This is Evangeline Brains Lilly. This has been Evangeline Lilly's Library of the Soul. And we'll see you next time around. You take care, mate. I'll see you soon.
You too. Thanks.
Bye-bye. You've been listening to Hard Agree. This episode was edited by John Horsley and Kenrick Regan, and our theme music, Golden, was written and performed for this show by Liverpool's finest band, Denio. Hard Agree is a production of the Spoilerverse and myself, Andrew Sumner.